Hello, my name is Jonathan Copulsky. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I am a member of the faculty at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, as well as the executive director of the Medill Spiegel Research Center. And I think you heard from my colleague, the research director at Malthouse earlier this week. I'm here today to talk to you about marketing technology, some of the options, some of the tough choices in a world of digital disruption. Thank you very much for spending time with me. We're going to cover 4 different topics. First, I'd like to share some research findings from a multi-year study that I helped to facilitate on digital disruption. And we'll talk a bit about the findings from the study, but also about what digitally mature organizations do differently. We're then going to pivot and talk a bit about marketing and how marketers use digital technologies to create value, with a focus on customer journeys and marketing processes. And then I'll take a look ahead and see what kind of opportunities there are for future research, but also importantly for marketing technology as we move forward. I'd like to frame and start this speech with some comments from Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice was the United States Secretary of State back during the administration of the first George H.W. Bush, as well as a provost at Stanford University and a distinguished researcher in her own right. And she talked about geopolitical conditions, but she said something to the effect of that which seemed at one time impossible is in retrospect inevitable. And the gist of what she was trying to communicate is sometimes we see things and we see that X or Y or Z has taken place, and we say, well, of course, that's obvious. But that's the benefit of hindsight. So I'd like to share with you some thoughts about what has happened, what might happen, what will happen. And I want you to keep in mind Condoleezza Rice's remarks that at one time something may have seemed impossible, but in retrospect, it seems inevitable. Some of the research is research that was done for a book that I co-authored in April 2019, published by MIT Press, called The Technology Fallacy. And it was really about how people adopt technology. And the key takeaway from the book, and what I'll share with you today, is that many leaders fall prey to a mistaken assumption that just because digital technologies, which are causing so much of the business disruptions that their organizations are experiencing, the solution is to implement digital technologies. But in fact, many of the barriers to the successful exploitation or leverage of digital technologies, it's not the technology itself, it's the culture of the organization, the strategic, the leadership, and the talent. And unless you get those right, putting in cutting-edge technologies in organizations which don't have the right organizational practices will not deliver the results and the value that you anticipate. So it's really about what we said in the subtitle, how people are the real key to digital transformation. So I'll start a bit with framing what the research was and what we learned. We did surveys of more than 16,000 business executives, managers, and analysts over a 5-year period of time. So we have lots of longitudinal data. We asked about their experience with disruption, as well as their perceptions of the nature and the adequacy of how their organizations responded to disruptions. We covered more than 157 countries, of which about a third were from the United States, and more than 30 industry sectors, with over a third of the respondents from billion-dollar-plus organizations. So we think we have a reasonably good global sample across many different industries and types of organizations. In addition to the surveys that we conducted, we did interviews with executives from some leading global firms, Walmart, Marriott, Google, Salesforce, as examples, and extensive secondary research in a variety of subjects that we thought were related to the topic of digital disruption and technology adoption. Not surprisingly, 85% of the companies that we survey agree that digital business is key to their success. But yet, less than a third would characterize themselves as maturing. More than almost half were developing, and about a quarter were early stages. Now, this is up over the years that we were doing the survey, but still less than a third who feel that they're digitally mature. When we ask the question about what is the difference between working in a digital environment versus traditional environment, all came to the issue of pace of business, and cultural mindset, and the flexible distributed workplace, which is interesting, particularly in this world of COVID-19, of how do we work well in a very different environment than environment that many of us grew up in. This notion of the pace of business, the culture, the mindset, and the distributed workplace. The other thing which was interesting about the companies that were digitally mature is if they were digitally mature, they also said that digital was at the core of their business, regardless of whether or not they were a technology company, because recognize many of the companies that we spoke to were old line legacy companies, steel manufacturing, paper manufacturing, bricks and mortar retail. But increasingly, the ones who were on the advent of digital maturity were the ones who said that we see that digital is at our core. Digital is our destiny. Digital will determine our future. They also told us that the organizations that were more mature tended to be more nimble. Words like agility, words like experimentation, continuous learning, recognition, rewards for collaboration, willingness to accept failure, and increasingly an organization around cross-functional teams. They tend to create an environment for learning and experimentation. They encourage new ideas to be shared and tested. They're supportive. They give feedback. They iterate. But they're also transparent. When things work, they are widely shared, but when things don't work, they also are widely shared. And how can we learn from everything that we do, whether it works or not, and recognize that not every experiment will be successful, because if we only have successful experiments, we're not trying enough different things. Another thing which surprised us was not that people want to work for a digital leader, but people of all age cohorts want to work for a digital leader. So even that group on the far right, the 6-year-old, of which I am a representative, want to work for a digital leader. But people don't want to work for companies that are not digitally mature, which becomes a challenge of success breeds success. But if you don't get into the loop, how do you bring on board the individuals who will help you to get where you need to go? And the biggest challenge to digital maturity is the willingness to take risks. And while many organizations gave lip service to the notion of, yes, we want to experiment, we want people to take risks, the perception in many organizations is that willingness to take risk, in fact, is not rewarded, and that risk is acceptable only if it results in success, which is an oxymoron. The other thing is that living in this world of digital maturity requires accepting ambiguity and constant change. And so taking risks, experimentation, living with ambiguity and change sounds like the world in which many of us are operating in today, in this world of COVID-19. And not surprisingly, employees want leaders willing to experiment. So as we went through this research, we found ourselves in a curious situation. The overwhelming majority of the respondents believe that digital is key to their future. The overwhelming majority of respondents believe that digital technologies will disrupt their industry and their business. But less than half of the respondents feel that their organizations are adequately preparing for disruptions that are projected to occur in their industry due to digital trends. So we've got this gap. We know that there's a problem, but we're not doing enough. And that led us down the path of trying to understand, what do digitally mature organizations do differently? Who are the ones who are able to overcome this know-and-do gap? And what is the digital DNA, if you will, that allows them to overcome or address this knowing-doing gap? And we found 4 things really stood out for us. The first is this notion of digital absorption. And by absorption, there's a term, absorptive capacity, the capacity to identify and assimilate new innovations at a rapid rate. And absorptive capacity could refer to an individual, but could also refer to an organization. So how do organizations increase their absorptive capacity so that they are better at absorbing these new innovations from a digital perspective? And there were three things that really stood out for us relative to increase of absorptive capacity. One was those organizations that were digitally mature tended to do a very good job of constantly monitoring and sensing outside their organization to effectively acquire knowledge about what outside organizations were doing. And this was not limited just to peer organizations, but more broadly. So if I'm a restaurant, maybe I could learn something from a hotel, but maybe could also learn something from a manufacturing company or also learn something from a retailer. The second is that they had an incredibly good job of increasing the velocity of the internal information flows. So what somebody learned in one part of the organization got rapidly transmitted to somebody in another part of the organization, particularly if those organizations were geographically remote. And they did this through both employee rotation, allowing people to move around and migrate through the organization, but also through collaborative tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams. And the third thing they did was that leaders really focused on helping employees understand the why. Why is it so important that we close this known doing gap? What is the strategic value? How will that make us sustainable and successful in the future? The second thing that digitally mature organizations do better is what's called affordances. And affordances is about being able to extract value from new capabilities that they find that the technology affords. Now, many times we see a technology and we scratch our heads and say, I'm not sure what that technology is good for. And many of us feel that way, for instance, about voice-first devices, things like Alexa. What am I going to do with it? How is that going to change my business? And organizations that are good at this experiment. They try it out. They learn things. And what they often discover, like duct tape, is that the original intended purpose, which in the case of duct tape was repairing HVAC systems, is not the only purpose. And they find new value and new uses and new applications far from what may have been envisioned when the company that launched the technology launched it. And I'm a little bit reluctant to share this, but I will, because we're among friends. If we look from a political standpoint, in the United States, our President Donald Trump has figured out a way to use Twitter in a manner as a megaphone, as a way to publicize his point of view that I doubt was ever envisioned by the founders and the developers of Twitter. And it's just become a platform which, who would have known? But he found an affordance. He was able to identify ways to use that particular technology that has tremendous value. And it's created, blown apart, if you will, the applications and the use of that particular technology. And I think that will happen with voice-first devices as we go forward. We're still looking for what are those applications, but we will find them, particularly since there are now hundreds of millions of those devices sitting around, ranging from devices in our phone to in standalone devices like Alexa Dot and so forth. The third capability of digitally mature organizations is they are great at testing. But not only do they test, but they test fast, they learn fast, and they scale fast. And the difference between the digitally mature and the less digitally mature organizations is not just testing, but the speed of the testing, but also their ability to take what they've tested and what they've learned and scale it. Test fast, learn fast, scale fast. Sometimes in Silicon Valley, people talk about fail forward. I hate that term fail forward because it's not about failing. It's about testing and learning and then scaling. So organizations that are good at testing, they test small, they test enough, and they have cross-functional teams involved in the testing so that they can rapidly disseminate the learnings systematically and broadly. And the last, not surprising, is around talent. They have the right talent. They bring the right talent. They're talent magnets, and they attract and retain employees and leaders with the right skills and mindset. Now, some of this is about putting yourself in the right place. So if we look in Chicago, where I happen to live, many organizations like McDonald's, like Walgreens, have decided to move downtown, like Caterpillar, because they know that the people that they're looking for don't want to commute out to the suburbs. So they locate in the right place. They've also changed the specs for the types of people that they're going to hire. So they look for talent in different places than they have been accustomed to looking. I mean, people with different degrees, or maybe no degrees. People who dress a little bit differently, people who look a little bit differently. If you go to the McDonald's headquarters in downtown Chicago, it looks very, very different than the McDonald's headquarters used to look in Oak Brook, Illinois, which was the original home for Hamburger U. If you have a chance, take a look, because you'll see a very different set of employees. It looks more like Google, which is only a few blocks away, than it looks like the McDonald's of 20 years ago. Third thing is that they commit to employee learning and development. Employees want to learn. They want to acquire new skills. They don't want to work for laggards. And they feel if they are not learning, they will rapidly be out of jobs. So the best, most digitally mature organizations are in this constant learning mode. They're always on it 24/7, even at tough times like we are right now. And last is that they leverage digital talent beyond their four walls, and that may be through acquisitions and alliances and ecosystems that allow them to tap into talent which may not necessarily be a talent who's always working for them as employees, but they may be contractors, they may be consultants, they may be alliance partners, they may be ecosystem partners, but they build that ecosystem in a way that allows them to take advantage of people that they might not otherwise be able to bring on board as employees. So those are the four things that digitally mature organizations do. Now let's turn our focus a little bit to marketers and how marketers use technology. And I'd argue that the single biggest value of technology when it comes to marketing is meeting customer expectations. And they have escalated dramatically. This is a study that was done by Salesforce, which was one of the leading software vendors in the customer space. And they do this State of the Connected Customer survey every other year. And the very, very first finding is that the percentage who say their standard for good experiences is higher than ever. 73% among business buyers, 64% among consumers. The expectations are high. They expect, 81% of business buyers expect that companies will understand their needs and expectations, 74% of consumers. Almost 80% expect that they can take their business elsewhere if their needs are not met. And 68% of business buyers expect that the companies will have cutting-edge digital experiences to keep their business. So the expectations are high from a customer experience standpoint. And 89% of the companies themselves said that they expect that they will compete mostly on the basis of customer experience, that each paid earned an own media touch point in the customer journey. One of my colleagues, J.Copulsky, who used to be an executive at Google, said the following in conjunction with a set of presentations that Jim and I made to Geo Institute in India about a month and a half ago. Marketing is all about making predictions to deliver the right, best personalized experience. So our job as marketers now is how do we predict what will be the right experience and then deliver it? But our confidence to do so is low. 85% of CMOs don't think their organizations are doing enough to personalize the customer experience. And when we talk about personalization, years ago, we had very uneven customer journey and experience. It was very tribal. And then we standardized it. And then we tried to tailor it by segment or persona. We taught people how to do segmentation. We taught people how to do personas. But the reality is what we want is highly responsive experiences which map to the customer journey based upon the understanding of the individual customer. And just because I look like somebody else doesn't mean my expectations are exactly the same. So we have to get down to the individual level, which is difficult to do at scale. We expect personalization. We expect the experience will anticipate how we will behave, predict it, and will be rich with recommendations, and it will also operate across multiple channels. Now, at the same time, that we're trying to deliver this wonderful experience to customers, we are also trying to create more scalable marketing processes. And once again, we are trying to create these scalable marketing processes, which means that we have to have standardized processes, reusable templates and tools, but the end goal is to make these processes scalable so we can do more with less. That means that if we use technology properly from a marketing operations standpoint, we can be more resource lean, we can be more data driven, and we can be more adaptive. So we can always do on the go learning about what's working, what isn't working, and change on the fly. So when we combine these two outside in and inside out perspectives, along the vertical dimension is building these responsive customer journeys through the adroit use of technology. On the horizontal is building highly scalable marketing processes and workflows. And at the same time as we automate these two axes with technology, is trying to derive analytically based insights about what's the impact on customers and what's the effectiveness of what we're doing in terms of the workflow and the processes and the cost of delivering these wonderful personalized customer journeys. Now, the challenge is there's a lot of technologies out there, and it's easy to get lost in this. This is a chart from Scott Brinker. Scott is an executive at HubSpot, which is a marketing technology vendor, but he also has a website called chiefmartech.com. I'd encourage you to look at this. He's been creating this marketing technology landscape chart for at least 10 years, and he started out, there were less than 200 technologies. There are now more than 8,000 technologies on the chart, and every year it gets bigger and bigger and shows no signs of decreasing, although the rate of expansion has slowed down slightly. And the challenge is, how do you navigate through all these different things? And I'd say let's start at least with grouping these into functionality. What we're really trying to use technology for is first to know the customer, understand who that individual is, recognize how to do what we call identity resolution so that we know the customer across different devices. We recognize them when they're interacting with us through different modes, different experiential dimensions. And then once we identify them, is start to personalize the experience, personalize the content that we deliver, make more dynamic, creative content in terms of what gets presented to them. And the third part is to engage them, orchestrate the different channels, and orchestrate that customer journey. So if we focus on this level, how do we know them? How do we personalize? And how do we engage with them? And then how do we build the tools in the back that will help us to analyze the impact and the effectiveness and give intelligence at all the various points of contact. Now, I tell my students, both at the executive education level and also at the graduate level, really think about this. It comes down to a bucket, 6 technologies that are most important kind of as the foundation. One is email, because that's still the bulk of the way that we communicate with people. I know it's not very sexy or exotic, but it's still the bulk of the way we treat people. But there are other ways we deliver experiences, the web, mobile, SMS, and increasingly maybe virtual reality goggles and so forth. So we have to think about other tools for experience delivery. And then we also have to think about social as a way to communicate. And that has changed tremendously, things like Instagram, things like TikTok right now. And that's a way that we communicate both with customers, but also with influencers. And then the back on the marketing process side, we have campaigns and the tools to manage campaigns. We have tools to manage the workflow. And finally, we have tools to do the analytics, both for the marketing processes and the customer journey. And those 6 buckets, if you will, are the foundational components of anybody's marketing technology stack. But in addition to having the stack itself, we also need a clear vision about how we're going to use marketing technologies to improve processes, become a more customer-obsessed enterprise. We also have to have the right resources, the marketing resources, the technical resources, the analytical resources. We need processes. We need to standardize those processes. And one of the things I have found over the years is that marketers don't tend to have a process mindset. It tends to be a one and done, and why do what we did before? Let's do it a little bit differently the next time, because that's what creativity is all about. So putting together that process and being more agile in that process is key to the success of being able to scale things, because it's hard to automate processes if they are not robust and standardized. We also need an architecture, infrastructure, and governance for capturing, managing unstructured and structured customer data. We need strategy and processes for using the analytics to understand customers and measure the impact of our program. So we need KPIs, we need standards about what constitutes the metrics that matter. And then finally, we need a process for managing all the technology that supports and drives that. So that's where marketing organizations are today in terms of how they are using technology and some of the challenges that they have using technology. But I want to focus the last part of this presentation on looking ahead, because I think that presents some interesting research opportunities for people in this audience. Now, I love this quote. It's from 4 years ago, Journal of Advertising, an article called Conceptualizing the Evolution and Future of Advertising. Technology has irreversibly changed the way that firms identify who is more likely to buy, what they are more likely to buy, when they are more likely to buy, why they are likely to buy, and how they are likely to buy, repurchase, and recommend. Technology. And there's a wonderful example. I'm sure all of you are familiar with McDonald's, one of the world's largest restaurant chains. Thousands and thousands of individual stores located around the world. And at least in the world of COVID-19, the drive-through has become extremely important. Fortuitously, McDonald's made an acquisition several years ago of an Israeli company called Dynamic Yield, and Dynamic Yield is an artificial intelligence organization. And you may say to yourself, well, what does artificial intelligence, restaurants, and drive-thrus have to do with one another? And the particular use case that is a compelling one, particularly in the age of COVID-19, is that using dynamic yield, McDonald's can scan the license plate of any vehicle that comes through the drive-thru, recognize the license plate, understand what was ordered the last time that that vehicle came through the drive-thru, and can even do it based upon time of day and day of week, and then display that information on the digital menu board that the customer sees when he or she is about to order. So they've personalized the experience, but from an operational standpoint, they've also reduced the amount of time that the customer may need to sort of scan through the menu and figure out what they might want, because what they've learned over time is most customers tend to order the same things repeatedly, or from the same bucket of things. So by reducing the work that a customer has to do to figure out what he or she might want, they're able to reduce the time that a customer spends in the drive-thru, speed vehicles through, and create a better experience. And they created a better experience, coincidentally, at a time when most restaurants in the US for McDonald's had to close their eat-in facilities. And so drive-thru becomes the primary way they interact with customers. AI, visual recognition, dynamic presentation, experience personalization, operational efficiency, all are driven. So that's the future. I also think we live in a world in which there's way too much choice. There's a wonderful book written a number of years ago by Barry Schwartz, who's a psychologist by background, former professor at Swarthmore College, called The Paradox of Choice. And Schwartz presents his own research and other research, which says when we have too many choices, we're overwhelmed. We're confronted with too many choices, we are paralyzed, and we don't make any choice. So what's the answer? The answer is recommendation systems. And I believe that increasingly, both for B2B and B2C, we will see more and more use of recommendation systems as a way that customers try to navigate their way through a very complex set of choices. We need to figure out, from a research standpoint, where do these things fit into the media and marketing ecosystem of the future? I know that Ed probably talked a little bit about that because that's one of his favorite topics. But what kind of recommendation systems work best for which different types of customers. And what's the right way to use the recommendation systems in the flow of the customer journey? Now, related to this is conversational interfaces. I mentioned this before. I believe that the growing capabilities, as well as the huge installed bases of things like chatbots and voice-first devices, will over time displace search. We'll do more and more voice search as opposed to text search. It creates opportunities for effective media and marketing. I know we're going to have another keynote on effective marketing, but it also creates an opportunity to have a conversation with a customer, which when combined with recommendation systems can be a very interesting set of journey characteristics of how does a customer navigate his or her way through the choices that they have, and what's the conversation, where do they go, and where do we take them, and how do we manage that conversation. So I believe that's also a rich, rich area for research for us to understand that dynamic and how brands and marketers can apply that dynamic to the customer experience that they help to deliver. And all this will happen, I believe, in a cookie-free future. So understanding how we gather the information generally through a first-party basis, which means now how do we encourage our customers to engage with us, and how do we collect the information with their permission? So I started this presentation with a quote from Condoleezza Rice. And Condoleezza Rice said, "What at one time seemed impossible in retrospect seems inevitable." So I think we'll look back a couple of years from now and say, of course, recommendation system, got it, check. Of course, conversational interfaces, and of course, a cookie-free future. So I encourage all of you to think about the research that we might do in that world, and how can we start to help marketers become more productive at using those tools and operating in that kind of environment, because those are the technologies that are going to matter, and helping to understand what it's going to take from an organizational perspective to effectively use those technologies. So I started out talking about technology adoption and this world of digital disruption, the increased pace of business, the shift in organization culture, the move to a flexible and distributed workplace. And when we wrote this book, little did we know that that has really been exacerbated by the arrival of COVID-19, but also greater expectations of productivity. We looked at the skills that leaders need: a transformative vision, a forward-looking perspective, digital literacy, but most importantly, adaptability. Learn fast, scale fast, all informed by testing fast. Now, marketers use digital technologies both on the journey side and on the process side, and create this digital trace data that helps them to inform what's working, what's not working. But it needs to start with the vision, with the processes and the resources before they focus on the technology. So the research is not how to build the best chatbot, but to understand the characteristics of the best chatbot, and from a customer standpoint, that will really motivate the customer to have a wonderful experience with us. So thanks very much for your time today. We've got a new book coming out next year, also from MIT Press, called The Transformation Myth. And it's really about how digital disruption has changed in this world of COVID-19, where suddenly we've compressed the pressures on an organization as a result of the need to operate at distance and the need to have contact-free interactions with customers and so forth, and what the learnings have been from that. So look for that. And certainly I would love it if you took a look at our book, The Technology Fallacy, and please stay in touch. And I hope you found this a useful way to spend your time, and would encourage you to continue the dialogue. Thank you so much.